Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can engage with us on Vimeo in the chat box. We'd also love it if you would sign up for our news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Today's episode is really interesting. It's about early NASA recruitment for women and Black Americans with Alan Ladwig and Dr. Angie Bukley. The Space Policy Show is pleased to hear from special guest Alan Ladwig, author of See You in Orbit, Our Dreams of Spaceflight, and Dr. Angie Bukley of the Aerospace Corporation, as they discuss the early days of NASA's astronaut recruitment efforts. Alan will discuss his research on the historical struggle for women and Black Americans to gain a seat in space. Today's host, Dr. Angie Bukley, is Assistant Principal Director for the Exploration, Science, and Technology Organization in the Human Exploration and Spaceflight Division at Aerospace Corporation. That is probably the longest title that I think I've ever heard. With over 35 years of experience, she has served in roles across industry, including several years at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. Over to Angie to introduce today's guest, Alan.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. And everyone, welcome to this edition of the Aerospace Corporation Space Policy Show. Glad you could join us. We've got a very special guest today, Alan Ladwig, and give you a little bit of background on Alan. In the mid-'80s, Alan was the manager of NASA's spaceflight participant program, including the competitions for the teacher in space and journalist in space. During that period, he received thousands and thousands of letters from private citizens who begged for an opportunity to be part of the space program and fly on the space shuttle. This inspired him a lot. He got a lot of very heartfelt letters and pleas for people to just, don't look any further. I'm your person. And so I think that was very inspirational for him. Alan left the agency in 1990 to write a book about the aspirations of all these dreamers. The project turned into a 30-year labor of love. Along the way, he returned to NASA as a political appointee, was on the ground floor of space.com, served as the chief operating officer of Zero Gravity Corporation during its startup phase, and worked for the Northrop Grumman Corporation. In 2013, he retired from a second stint as a political appointee at NASA. And with progress being made in the commercial sector towards the elusive goal of space tourism, he pulled the book back off of the back burner, and it finally looked like he could end the story on a positive note. So his book, See You in Orbit, it is the outcome of that work. So because we're still waiting for routine commercial spaceflight to become available, the book is still has staying power and remains very relevant. The book covers 70 years of history, but today, Alan and I are going to focus on the long and winding road to space, to diversity in space. And indeed, it has been a long and winding road, hasn't it, Alan?
Yes, it has. It beginning with the early 60s, when they were selecting NASA astronauts, women and minorities had already tried to get in and be part of that dream, and were pushed back continually.
Yeah, it seemed, in doing a little bit of research for this show, it seemed like, it was inordinately difficult, particularly in the early years of spaceflight. It turns out that 573 people have been to space. That's counting the 4 that launched yesterday. Of those 573, only 65 have been women, and that's just a little over 11% of the population that's flown to space. And what I think was really kind of sad is it took 22 years, okay, from 1961, from Alan Shepard's first flight, it took 22 years for NASA to fly both the first U.S. female astronaut and the first U.S. Black astronaut.
That's right.
So
when Sally Ride flew in on STS-7 and Guy Bluford flew on STS-8, it was finally the culmination of a dream that these demographics had dating back into the 60s when the astronaut corps started, but even much earlier than that. Women and minorities have been striving to get into space just like everybody else since the 50s. You can go back farther. Let's go back to 1919 when Robert Goddard wrote the Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. Here he's talking about a theoretical rocket to the moon. He received hundreds of letters from people around the world that wanted to volunteer to fly on this theoretical rocket, men, women from all kinds of countries. Then you scoot up to 1950, where at the Hayden Planetarium, the historian Willie Lay gave a presentation on the conquest of space. They put up an interplanetary tour reservation booth for the people that came that night, and you could sign up. Where do you want to go? Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And the estimated date of departure was 1975. Over the next 3 years, 22,000 people signed up for such a journey. And then in the 70s, or in the late 60s, Pan American had a first moon flights club. 93,000 people signed up. So the dream of spaceflight has been with us for decades, and things really started to happen in the early 60s when NASA selected the 7 original Mercury astronauts.
Yeah, and there's been a number of concepts over many years, even going back to von Braun and beyond, and further back than that, concepts of rocket ships, if you will, that would take citizens into space. And I know that even NASA at one time, I think during the late 70s, had a concept for the space shuttle where it had a lot of passenger seating, and it was just, I don't think they ever really did anything with it, but I've seen the drawings where they would actually sell tickets and take people into space. Did you know anything about that?
Yeah, that was actually proposed by a private company that wanted to sink a module in the cargo bay, and then they were going to sell tickets to go. It ultimately never got approved by NASA. The other curious part of that was, in the illustrations I saw, I never saw windows on the ceiling of the capsule. So I'm not sure you'd want to go and be spamming the can and pay all that money. But it was, over the years, there have been many concepts that have been put forward for private citizens to fly in space.
Yeah. And one day we'll get there, hopefully soon. So you referred a few minutes ago to that first group of astronauts, the Mercury 7. Let's talk a little bit about the recruitment of those individuals, some of the things they had to go through, and just think about the requirements that were imposed on individuals who wished to be an astronaut back at the time, and some of those requirements that were actually very exclusive to individuals who couldn't fly jets, for example.
Right. Well, at first, NASA was going to put out an announcement that would invite any and all comers to apply to be an astronaut. And then President Dwight Eisenhower got involved, and he thought that was going to get too confusing and too many people that wouldn't be qualified. So Robert Gilruth, the head of the Manned Space Task Force at NASA, said that was one of the best decisions that Eisenhower had made, because it ruled out matadors, mountain climbers, scuba divers, and people that wouldn't be qualified. So Eisenhower decided we would only select from military test pilots. And that then gave you people that already had a security clearance, that had experience with operational flights, and that was what they decided to do at first. From that came the first 7 astronauts. The Mercury 7, they immediately became America's heroes. They were compared to Superman, and everybody fell in love with them. They came at the right time for the country. Their stories were told in Life magazine and in other publications, but they truly were the top of the pinnacle.
Right. Yeah, and I've read about, what heroes these guys were at the time. You mentioned Life magazine. They did a cover with the astronauts, but didn't they also do one with the astronauts' wives?
Yes, that was in September of 1959. And a week after the cover with the original 7, they had the wives of the original 7. So kind of the only time we were hearing about women very much were as the wives. Behind every great man, there was a woman. And these women were the female astronauts. And their stories were also told in the Life magazine, were their husbands, but they certainly were a secondary thought.
Right. I wonder how it would have worked out if one of the original Mercury 7 had been a single guy. How would they have covered that?
Right.
Well,
at the time,
oh, go ahead.
At the time, the only notion about women in space, kind of from 1959 through 61, there was very little thought given to women actually being part of an astronaut corps. More often in the cultural platforms of the time, women were seen as consumers, as space vixens, as stewardess, but nobody really took it to heart that they should be part of the program. In fact, cartoons routinely poked fun at the idea of women in space, and it just wasn't something that was taken seriously for quite a while.
Yeah, and even in 2001 Space Odyssey, the woman that you see is a flight attendant on the shuttle.
Right.
All the astronauts are men. In fact, many of the early science fiction movies, you didn't see women participating as space explorers themselves. So,
not at all.
So let's talk a little bit about your chapter called Astro Chicks. I think the story of Jackie Cochran is very, very interesting, and Ms. Cobb as well, and all of those women who were invited to participate with Dr. Loveless out in Albuquerque. Tell us what happened there and how far things didn't get with that story.
Well, yeah, what occurred was just 5 months after the Mercury 7 astronauts were introduced as kind of our next star sailor, Jerry Cobb came on the scene. She was an aviatrix from Oklahoma. She had 7,000 hours as a flyer on 60 different types of aircraft, more hours than any of the Mercury astronauts, but not in jets. And that was the big no-no. And so she happened to be at a conference in Miami in 1959, in the fall of 59, and ran into Dr. Randolph Lovelace and Brigadier General Donald Flickinger, who were the people involved in the Mercury physical test. So they wondered, well, how would a woman fare in such tests? So they asked Jackie if she'd be willing to go through the 3 phases of medical training or medical test, and she immediately agreed and said yes. So she went ahead, went through all 3 phases of the Mercury astronaut test, passed with flying colors, did as well or better than men. And Dr. Lovelace was so excited about that he gave a paper on it in the International Astronautical Federation Conference in the fall of 1960. And then that announcement that he made there led to articles in Life magazine, in Time. Jerry became an international celebrity. She got mail by the bags full. She was in demand as a speaker. Somebody even wrote a song about her. And that was all great except for one thing. NASA never asked for the test. So then Dr. Lovelace thought, well, to make sure that Jerry's not just a one-off and something that wouldn't occur repeatedly, he wanted to validate it with more women. So he wanted to bring in 12 more female pilots to go through the test. Jerry and Sky Queen Jacqueline Cochran, who had been the only woman to break the sound barrier at that time and had been the head of the Women's Air Force service pilots during the war. And the two of them identified these 12 women. And because Jackie Cochran also happened to be a successful cosmetic executive, she paid for all their travel, room and board for them to attend the test. So those next 12 went through the first 2 phases of the test, and then they were going to report to Pensacola for the 3rd phase, and the Navy canceled the program. And there was no explanation given other than the Navy said, well, NASA hadn't submitted the paperwork that showed there was a requirement for the test. And so they said, hey, don't look at us, it's NASA's fault. So then Jerry Cobb went to NASA and said, what gives? They said, well, we don't have a requirement for this. That in turn led to supposed to be 3 days of House hearings on the Science Committee on astronaut qualifications, where Jerry tried to get answers to why the tests were canceled. And the transcript of that hearing is well worth reading. It'll make most people that are in favor of women's rights and women being part of the space program, your hair will go on fire because of some of the things that were said.
Well, Alan, that was a really interesting story about the women. There was a really interesting documentary that aired recently on Netflix. It was called The Mercury 13. And there were interviews with some of these, the women who are still alive. And I thought that was very moving. And I found it just inspirational, all of the things that they went through and yet didn't ever get the opportunity to go to space, which is just really too bad. And it wasn't just women who had issues getting into the space program. People of color, Black people, had a lot of trouble too. Let's talk a little bit about the getting more diverse group of people into the spaceflight business.
Yes, in 1962, Edward R. Murrow, the famous CBS reporter who was then the head director of the United States Information Agency, sent a letter over to Jim Webb and said, why don't you fly an African-American as an astronaut? And that this would be great for NASA, for the country's image, and it would show the U.S. space program in a different light to the rest of the world, which was mainly not white. So that was his notion, and he encouraged James Webb, the administrator of NASA, to think about that. At about the same time, Whitney Young, the head of the National Urban League, contacted President John F. Kennedy, and he recommended that an African-American fly, and specifically recommended Air Force Captain Edward Dwight. So Kennedy ended up inviting Dwight to come to Edwards Air Force Base to the test pilot school. And what they had going there was a 2-phase program where pilots went through it. And if they passed the first phase, they got through a second phase. If they made it through that phase, they could become an astronaut. Dwight had problems with this from the beginning. People there, the other officers, were not very welcoming to him. There's a part in the book that I mentioned where a senior official came up and said horribly racial things to Captain Dwight. Who brought you here? The NAACP, some Muslim? Why in the heck would a Negro ever want to fly in space? And if it was up to him, that particular officer, it would never happen. And if it was up to him, African Americans wouldn't even be Air Force pilots. So it was a horrible situation he was faced with. He did complete phase 1. He was not approved to go through phase 2 and spent the next 3 years fighting against the Air Force, trying to get recognition for African American pilots. He eventually got tired of it. He resigned from the Air Force, and he became a famous art sculptor out in Colorado. But it was a horrible situation. And it wasn't until 1967 that strides were, another little step was made. And that's because President Lyndon Johnson wanted to relook at the idea of an African American in space. And from that, Major Robert Lawrence was accepted into an Air Force program called the Manned Orbiting Lab. And this was going to be a two-person vehicle to serve as kind of a space station. And Major Lawrence, an African-American PhD person with 2,500 jet flight hours, and he was going to go into that program. Tragically, just 6 months after he was selected, he was killed in a crash as an instructor in the back seat of an F-104. And it would take another 11 years before African Americans got anywhere close to the launch pad.
Yeah, that's another one of those sad stories as we work to make the astronaut corps much more diverse than it was initially. So a lot has happened, which is very good. But as I understand it, even when NASA decided to fly scientist astronauts, there was pushback from the fighter pilot group.
Yes, I'd like to read something from the book on that episode. Since 1962, the National Academy of Sciences had been encouraging NASA to fly a scientist. In fact, they wanted a scientist to be on the first Apollo mission to the moon. And NASA really wasn't all that interested. But finally, in 1964, scientists were allowed to apply for a Group 4 astronauts. 909 scientists applied, 4 of which were women, none of the women were selected. And then finally, in June of 1965, the first all-male science astronauts were selected. And for a number of years, they were referred to as the hyphenated astronauts, science-astronauts. And the author, Thomas Wolfe, wrote about this in a Rolling Stone article where he said, confronted with the fact that there are going to be a new breed called science astronauts. What is this? These guys aren't even Cessna weekenders, the majority of them. The right stuff? No stuff, baby. It was suddenly like integrating the Masonic Lodge with black women. So clearly, jet jockeys felt that they were still the only ones that deserved to go into orbit.
Yeah, it took a while. So, but things evolved, and we moved through the Apollo years. We succeeded in landing on the moon, beating the Russians or the Soviets at the time. And then the shuttle program got introduced, and it seems after that things started to open up just a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit about what had to happen so that women, people of color, just a much more diverse group of astronauts could be established.
Yeah, well, the shuttle program was approved in January of 1972. The last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, was December of 1972. So here was this new vehicle that President Richard Nixon said was going to take the astronomical cost out of astronautics. And that was the goal, make it cheaper to fly in space. And originally, they talked about the shuttle would fly 60 times a year, would only need 3 astronauts at a time, 3 crew members with 4 seats for passengers. So this got everybody all psyched up and excited that, boy, maybe there's going to be a chance for civilians to fly. And the shuttle became kind of a cultural phenomena. At the rollout of the Enterprise, the orbiter that was used for landing tests, they had the crew of Star Trek there. Star Trek fans had demanded that the first orbiter be named the Enterprise. Originally, it was going to be called the Constitution. So people started paying attention. Articles appeared that advertised the shuttle as the new prairie schooner to the stars. So everybody got all excited and thought, okay, here's our chance to start flying. There was still a question in the early stages about whether or not women would be able to fly or if they were going to get in the way of things. Again, in the book, there's some great quotes about what people were saying. Ms. Magazine did a repeat or did a story on those original 12 astronauts in the mid 70s and really took NASA to task for that. They still had these antiquated views about women in space. And thankfully, by 1976, women and minorities were finally encouraged to apply to become NASA astronauts. Dr. David Winter, the head of life sciences at NASA, said there was no reason women shouldn't apply and could be active members of the crew. So that was a good thing. And in January of 1979, pilots and the first mission specialists were announced. This was the largest naming of astronauts at the time. There were 35. They referred to themselves as the 35 new guys. And among those new guys were the first women, the first African Americans, the first Asian American. So from 1981 to 2011, the diversity continued. Things did get better over time. 135 shuttles were launched with 2 mission tragedies. But we saw that things finally started opening up. And now today, things are even better.
Today, things are much better in terms of women being integrated into the astronaut corps and it being much more diverse. And I think, when they introduced the role of the mission specialists, and for a while, we had a position called payload specialist. I know several individuals who flew into space as payload specialists, but that opened doors for more people to qualify to become astronauts.
Yes, that was an opportunity for companies to have one of their employees fly with a payload. Originally, it was used as a commercial incentive to have companies fly their satellites on the shuttle. But after the Challenger accident, NASA wasn't allowed to do that. There were still going to be some science payload specialists. Charlie Walker, McDonnell Douglas was the first. To my knowledge, I don't think there were ever any female payload specialists that have flown.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any women who flew as payload specialists. So fortunately, things improved, and then we started seeing people paying to take trips up to the space station. Some of the first space tourists shelled out a lot of money to go to space. I think it was Mr. Tito was the first person to do that, right?
Yes, in April of 2001, Dennis Tito became the first space tourist researcher to fly to the International Space Station, but not through NASA. He flew through Russia because Russia was actually more commercially aware than NASA was. NASA pushed back on this tremendously. They did not want these people on the space station. But eventually, 7 people flew under that program. One guy flew twice. The first woman, Anush Ansari, flew. She was an Iranian American. She went on to become the donor behind the $10 million X Prize, which led to suborbital space tourism. So these people paid anywhere from $20 to $55 million to fly to the space station. I always thought NASA was wrong to downplay it. To me, it showed that people thought there was real value in going to the space station, that they were willing to pay $55 million.
Absolutely. And the first time I did some research into space tourism was back in 2000. And we wrote I was working with a group of students, and we wrote a detailed report on, when we thought the X Prize would be awarded. We only missed it by a year. We nailed the winner. But it seems like for so long, we've just been 1 year away from that first flight, where passengers actually go up. And there's been a number of companies that have come and gone. And I'd just like to get your opinion on where you think we are with that, and when might we be able to start not just buying tickets to go into space, but actually using those tickets?
Yes, I refer to that in the book as, are we there yet? we've been waiting since 2004 when both Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic owned by Richard Branson, Blue Origin by Jeff Bezos, have been promised or have been working on suborbital flight. They both have had a number of successful test flights. Tragically, Virgin Galactic had one test flight where a pilot was killed in a crash, but we're still waiting. There's been a lot of written, especially in the British press, kind of making fun of all of Richard Branson's promises that each year, okay, and in 6 months, I'm going to be flying. And this has gone on and on and on since about 2011, at least. The latest was he was supposed to fly in the early quarter of 2021, but just recently they announced that they're going to have to cancel their test flights for later towards the end of 2020 because of COVID. So that's unfortunate. So my guess is that it'll be at least 2021 before any commercial person is able to fly. At the moment, Virgin Galactic charges $250,000. I've read that could increase in price. Blue Origin has yet to set a price, and they don't sell tickets yet. Virgin has sold over 600 tickets and have people standing by. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see it come, and if there's any way I can figure out how to do it, maybe I'll just have to propose an experiment that needs my personal attention to be executed and get a flight on one of those things. And I think NASA is already looking for experiments to fly.
Exactly. There's a call out, and if your experiment needs a suborbital flight, NASA will pay for that to happen. I believe Alan Stern, the former or the program manager of the flight to Venus, has been the first person selected for that. There's also going to be scientists that fly to the space station with a program called Axiom. That's a private company that has a logistics model attached to the space station, and they're going to charge $55 million to get you up there. Then you have to pay $34,000 a night to NASA for your room and board and air and Wi-Fi. But we're going to see more and more of this kind of thing happening.
Yeah, that kind of puts it out of reach for normal people, but certainly something that could be afforded by private corporations and industry, perhaps, or even other government agencies and so forth. So yeah,
right.
And I even understand they're going to do a movie on the space station.
Yes, Tom Cruise is going to the space station to do a movie. I've also read that the Russians are sending up a female actress to participate in a movie. I don't know. It's unclear to me if that's the same movie as Tom Cruise or if that's a different one. But Hollywood is going to space, baby.
Yep. Yeah, and that's not surprising because when Tom Cruise did the movie The Mummy, the airplane crash scene where they're kind of flying around and, obviously in microgravity, they did all those scenes on the Novaspace Airbus 310 out of Bordeaux. So they were doing that in actual parabolic flight so that it was very, very realistic. And I think Mr. Cruise really enjoyed the microgravity experience. And I think that was inspirational to moving on to trying to do this movie on the space station. I think it's going to be really interesting. So
it'll be fun to see what he does.
It will be, and you can be sure people will pay to go see whatever it is he does. So
yes,
anyway, but we have come a long way. We've celebrated now 20 years on the International Space Station. We've had the first all-female EVA. So things are moving along, and it's really a pleasure to see that sort of thing happening. It's been a long time coming, and I think even things are getting better just in the entire engineering field for women in particular. Because I remember when I first started, it was a long time ago. I mean, you had to really make some noise to get some attention. But I've seen that change in a very good way over the years that I've been involved in the space program. I even did 7 years at NASA Marshall, so that was interesting as well. But now
it's been very encouraging to see all the focus on STEM or STEAM education. Companies are getting behind it, the government's getting behind it, and things are improving. And even on the November 15th flight of the Dragon 2 space capsule to the space station, we saw a very diverse crew. Shannon Walker, a female, Victor Glover, the first African-American who will be at the space station for an extended period of time, Mike Hopkins as the commander, and a JAXA, a Japanese astronaut agency, astronaut Soichi Noguchi. So things are going to continue to be that way. And Jeanette Epps was recently named as the first African-American female that will be on board the first operational flight of Boeing Starliner whenever that takes place.
Awesome. That's just wonderful news. And but kind of coming back around, closing the circle on this whole space thing, and hopefully getting citizens the ability to go up in space. I think from all I've read, when you're in space and you can look down on the Earth, it's the overview effect. It just kind of changes the way people think about the Earth, and it kind of helps you see how vulnerable we are, because you can actually see that little thin strip of blue atmosphere and realize that's what's keeping us alive.
Right, and it's been described as a transformational activity, and that when people get that view, they don't see borders, they just see Earth as a whole. That many of the astronauts come back and have a different view of their place in the world, a different consciousness. I joined an organization in 1970, one of the first space advocacy groups, called the Committee for the Future. Barbara Marx Hubbard, who led that organization, used to speak about the evolutionary spiral and how space was going to help us raise our consciousness and become better human beings. I have my moments of cynicism, but I still deep down believe in that goal. And I think that's what space can help bring about.
Well, let's hope so. Well, it's been a really interesting discussion, Alan. Were there any additional points you'd like to raise before we wrap up?
Just that I published the book a year ago, but I think it's still, as you said earlier, it still has a shelf life to it. The history, of course, hasn't changed. My predictions about the future haven't been all that far off. I certainly didn't think we would launch until late 2020 at the earliest. Now it's not going to be till 2021, but I tell many stories in there about all the people that have been involved in the last 70 years of trying to make this dream come true. So I encourage people to check out the book. It's available on Amazon. I'll do a shameless plug. Holidays are coming. Give this gift to your favorite space cadet, and see you in orbit.
Well, thanks for your time, Alan. It's been really interesting and fun talking with you. And that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Space Policy Show. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
A big thanks to Alan and Angie for this discussion, and thank you to our production team, James Liggins and Sarah Pannoni, located in the Los Angeles area. As always, check us out on Twitter, # Space Policy Show, and sign up for our latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Next week, we will not be broadcasting in recognition of the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. However, tune in on Thursday, December 3rd for a discussion on missile taxonomy, a new way of classifying missiles beyond ballistic.